usually does take a little bit, but once you start to, okay, so I think we're now recording. So this is pretty informal. So you can either ask Ted questions, kind of audio style, or just put them in the chat. I know some folks here are not able to chat out loud at the moment. So if you can do that in the comments, that'd be great. And just for anybody watching, this is a meeting of the Dalten Collective. It's kind of a hangout, and what we're doing here is just sort of asking Ted some general questions about Urbit, some of the stuff that he's working on, and anything else related to what does it mean to own a star collectively, or to manage it collectively, and to pool resources together around some point on the Urbit network to do something interesting. So that's what we're here to do today. So I have a few questions, and if it's all right, maybe I'll just go ahead and lead off. So Ted, I know that you did a lot of work on Ames, which is the networking layer for Urbit. And I was kind of wondering if you could tell me sort of so people know that TCP/IP is that's the networking protocol that runs the internet. UDP, that universal plug and play, is another networking protocol. And now we have Ames. So we have these sort of three things here. So how do they sort of compare and contrast to one another? What kind of guarantees might you get in one network versus another, that kind of thing?
Sure. Let's see, I'm trying to figure out where to start to answer this. I think, yeah, I mean, I can talk about existing protocols first, and then talk about how Ames is an answer to some of the problems inherent in most protocols.
Cool.
Yeah, Ames is probably closest to TCP. And it currently, but it's designed to be an overlay protocol. So it can overlay over IP, which is how it works right now, IPv4. You could also overlay it over other things. There's been some discussion of overlaying it over, for example, I2P. From inside of Arvo, Ames is entirely agnostic to what kind of address you use for the sort of physical address of where an Urbit chip is. So that's purely a runtime consideration. You could write a different Urbit runtime without changing the Arvo kernel, and should seamlessly be able to transfer over to some other kind of network if you wanted to run Urbit on, say, a mesh network or something like that. So Ames is an overlay protocol in much the same way that like TCP is also an overlay protocol. So yeah, as you mentioned, TCP and UDP are two of the major ways that people communicate on the internet. The difference really is that UDP is very simple. It's just you send a packet and hope it gets there. Yeah. So that's it, really. It's like, here's a packet, here's how long it is, it's on this port. Maybe there's like one other piece of metadata in there, but it's not much. So if you want to, the problem is that with UDP is that wires aren't perfect and routers aren't perfect. And in general, if you try to send someone a piece of information over a network, they might not get it. And even if you send 3 packets in a row, even if they do get them all, they might come in out of order. And so the concept of transmission control is the idea of just T and C and TCP. It implies a number of things, but this idea that you can know that at least within a connection, you send a certain set of packets to somebody, you can know that they got them because they'll send you acknowledgements, ACKs, in response. And so you can say, okay, because we're both speaking the same language, I know that if you send me an ACK for this, I know you actually got it. That's the idea. And within a connection, you'll also have a sequence number. You'll number which packet is which, so that if you get them out of order, you can say, okay, well, I got number 4 and then I got number 3, but I can suppose them around. It's fine. Right? And there's also TCP also has congestion control built in, right? So, and there are various approaches to this, but basically if I need to send you a long message that consists of many packets, I need to know how fast to be putting bits onto the pipe. And so like if you, for example, you're acting, and then you like slow down and stop acting me for a while, like I shouldn't just keep spewing bits at you. Like I should slow down, go back, maybe set a timeout, wait for a little while, resend some older packets, right, that kind of thing. And so that's kind of a whole field of congestion control. And that's something that you have to, for anything that's going to serve the purpose that TCP serves, you have to have something like that. So Ames has one of those also. It's actually very based directly off of TCP Reno, new Reno, which is probably the most widespread TCP congestion control algorithm. We had to adapt it a little bit for Ames. Okay, so that's the idea, right? Like TCP is this way of, if you know somebody's IP address, you should be able to send them a whole message worth, a whole sequence of messages within a connection, and know that they actually get them. Reliable delivery. So Ames has this guarantee also, but it's designed to work in a bit of a different way. First of all, the big differences really are that TCP doesn't have any conception of identity or encryption. So like, it's just IP address, basically. So the actual kind of like low level packets that get sent back and forth to like establish a connection and this sort of thing, those aren't encrypted. So any kind of encryption or identity system that you want to have on top of TCP, you have to build it kind of on top of it. And this is the source of a huge number of security problems, as you might imagine. It's like you're trying to build a secure thing on top of an insecure thing. And people, there are ways to do that. It's very complicated, and you can spoof TCP packets, you can spoof ACKs, you can spoof all kinds of stuff, because all these you can spoof IP addresses for that matter, right? So like because there's no cryptographic component to TCP, right? It's not this idea of like, okay, I'm a person, I have some secret associated with my identity. My address is permanent, and I'm going to send a message to another address that's also permanent, that has cryptographic information associated with it. And Urbit, Urbit is very much based on this idea that you should have one consistent identity digitally. It should be a permanent identity that you have your whole life, more or less. You can sell it if you want, but essentially, you're probably going to want to hold on to it forever. And that address, when you buy it, you get to set the cryptographic keys for that address that only you know. So you have a private key, and you list the public key in some public place. Currently, that's Ethereum. And then other people can use that public key to send you messages. And so in Ames, that's how the whole thing works. It's not, and there isn't even really a concept of a connection in Ames. Or alternatively, you could say that a connection in Ames lasts forever. And so what that means is that the sequence numbers are permanent, right? It's like which packet is which. That's just one totally ordered sequence of packets from one identity to another identity. Within a continuity, or I'll say that for technical correctness. So Ames is actually solving a kind of, it's a slightly different problem from the TCP solves, but in practice, it's very similar, and it just gives you a bunch more guarantees. So because of this system where the sequence numbers are permanent, you avoid problems with basically every packet becomes idempotent, right? Which means like if you receive the same packet twice, nothing happens any differently from if you just received it once. And because you also get this totally ordered sequence of packets, we often say that this is an exactly once delivery system, which means that if you write an application that uses Ames inside of Urbit, then if somebody sends you a message, Ames guarantees to you that you will only ever receive that message once and that you will receive it in the correct order. TCP can't make this guarantee by itself because the connections can stop and start. And because there's sort of an information theoretic problem there where you might think the connection's still going, but I think it's dead, right? And so when things stop and start in that way, it's very difficult to know. So what ends up, that people can build exactly once delivery systems on top of TCP, and they've been doing it all the time. I think like Microsoft SQL Server and Kafka have their own implementations of this. It does also require persistence, right? So Urbit is a persistent event log transactional computer, right? It gets an event, writes it to disk, and then only after writing that event to disk does it emit the effects of running that computation. And those effects include like an ACK, network ACK. So you actually need something like that. You need some concept of persistence in order to actually implement this kind of guarantee in your networking. But it's a very nice guarantee to have, because it means that, like, if you write, for example, if you write some kind of app in Ames, you don't have to have that thing that a lot of like airplane flight websites have, where say like don't click the buy button a second time, don't click it. That's an idempotence problem, right? It really should be like you click the buy button. That only applies something once, even if you click it multiple times, right? You should be able to resend those packets as many times as you want. It shouldn't cause a second purchase to happen. But again, that requires some concept of persistence in order to work. Persistence in the sense of you have to be able to write it to disk, know that the data is not volatile, that it'll still be there. So these are the big differences between Ames and TCP, right? So Ames gives you every packet is encrypted and authenticated. You know exactly who it's coming from, and no one else can see the contents. And it gives you exactly once delivery in a connectionless manner. It's packet oriented. I mean, the other nice thing about this, by the way, is that like I don't know if you've ever tried to upload or download a very large file.
Mm-hmm.
It has a tendency not to work. Actually, the company I worked at before I worked at Urbit was a microscopy company, and we had these huge image files. Yeah, often we just try to download a single image and break halfway through and have to retry. But it was a big problem trying to deliver the data that we gathered to customers. What we ended up doing was just literally mailing them a hard drive, because the networking protocols that we typically use are so bad at this. There are actually ways of doing TCP, getting a connection to try to restart and whatever, but they're not implemented in very many places. So in Ames, if I decide to, let's say, subscribe to some like a media channel that you have. So for example, if you were hosting this video on your Urbit, and I wanted to download that, if that was one big Ames message, then if I started that download and then closed my laptop and got on a plane, got off the plane 10 hours later and in some other place, my Urbit would continue to download and pick up from exactly where it left off. It would be totally seamless.
Yeah.
There you go. Does that answer your question?
It certainly does, and I think it's important to sort of tease apart some of those nuances, which is to say, having a persistent connection doesn't actually mean that your Urbit is, quote, online and running. It does mean, however, though, that it's almost as if it was, meaning that it moves in lockstep so that it can start up exactly where it left off, like there was no break in connection.
Right. Yeah, I think that it's always important to remember that in computer networking, the concept of a connection is always just an abstraction. It's never real. Mm-hmm. There are pulses that go across somehow, right?
Yeah.
Bits happen, and then sometimes they don't happen. And any idea that we have about a connection existing or not existing is some piece of state that's either in our minds or in the computer's heads, right? Not that they have heads, but what are those things called?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that it's actually better to describe Ames as connectionless rather than permanent connections. Um, but yeah, it's really just that it doesn't have a concept of connection exactly. It's just I know who you are. I know what the last packet that I sent to you was that you act, and so I'm going to send you the next one whenever I get a chance,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to enqueue more.
Cool. All right. So my next question is something related to Eric.
Hey.
On our offsite that the Talon folks had just recently. We were talking about sort of like Ames is a service or something like, when you send a message, the other Urbit on the other end of that connection, it just has to look and feel like it doesn't necessarily have to be one. And why that's relevant to the people on this call potentially is that a star, if it's going to be providing some useful service, is likely going to have a lot of things that it does, and it probably isn't going to do that thing, or at scale anyway, in just one instance of Urbit. It might try to take some of those things and separate them so that it can do, and even combine them with the other existing technologies to add service or add benefit to the network. So could you talk about what it would mean to like see either use Ames or even other parts of Urbit, like almost like containerizing them and using them in a larger setting?
Sure, yeah. This is a fun topic, and I think it's something that is really not obvious until you kind of soak yourself in Urbit for a while. Because Urbit has a very unusual property of being defined entirely abstractly. Sometimes we call it an axiomatic computing system, right? And what that means is, in order to implement Urbit, in order to implement knock, right, to have a knock interpreter, all you need to agree on basically is just the concept of an ordered pair, the concept of an arbitrarily large number that's greater than or equal to 0. And then you have to and that's it. And then you actually just have to run the knock function on those numbers. And how you do that, you run the knock function, how you store the numbers, entirely up to you. Now there are some extra constraints from running Arvo, because Arvo is a particular knock program, right? And so there's a protocol between Arvo and Ver, or the runtime. Right? So Arvo is the kernel of the Urbit operating system, which is run by a runtime system, a VM called Ver. So Ver is the program that you run on Linux or macOS or whatever. And so there's a protocol that those two things speak. It's a very simple protocol, but relatively simple. It's like there's something like 20 different kinds of tasks that the runtime can ask Arvo to perform, and Arvo can respond with, I don't know, 20 or 30 different kinds of effects, something like that. There's really not that much to it, and it's static. It can change a little bit over time, but only as we change the version numbers of Arvo, and those themselves decrease down to 0. So this whole thing will eventually freeze. And the reason I'm mentioning all of this is that you don't, apologies for the loud noises here, by the way. This is the dulcet tones of construction in San Francisco. It's really conducive to getting good work done, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, the reason I bring this up is Urbit is fundamentally a specification, in the same way that Unix is a specification. But the Urbit spec encompasses a lot more because it encompasses all these networking concerns and how state is maintained over time, right? Like how just the state of your operating system is this abstractly defined tree that you can then, export from one machine, import it into some other machine that might even store it totally differently. As long as they can convert between it, as long as they know how to convert between different representations of that tree. But this is also the case that a knock interpreter, the way we run it right now is it's one process that runs on Unix, right? That's not the only way to do it. You can do it however you want. And for a star, not only do you not necessarily want to just run it in one process, but you might want to run it on multiple machines. You might not want those machines to even live in the same data center. And you might even not want those machines to be running the normal, like what we normally think of as Urbit at all. Because the star's responsibility is not to be like a personal node for a person. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It needs to look like one over the network, but only in so much as it's responsible for doing routing and propagating kernel updates and whatever other add-on services the star decides to do. And there might be many of those. But the thing to imagine really, I think, is that long-term, a star is likely to be actually like a data center, a part of a data center worth of machines, and then also a bunch of edge nodes scattered maybe all around the world or all around some region for which it provides routing services. So it's sort of like a combination of an ISP and a CDN.
Mm-hmm.
Familiar with those. Right, so a star is a logical entity. It is not necessarily a physical entity or like one single physical entity. This is actually true of all Urbit nodes, but for most of them, it's, in practice, most of them will be single physical entities for the most part. But this is one of the benefits of having an abstractly defined computing system is you can implement it however you want. And so, I think one thing that's very interesting to think about with a star is, you could have, for example, a bunch of routers behind a load balancer that do the actual Ames packet routing. And then you could have, for kernel updates, maybe you just run a normal Urbit that sort of hooked up behind those in some way. Or maybe you run I guess for the Dalten Collective, you might not want, you probably want that Urbit chip to be configured in some way that it's actually listening to, let's say it's listening to an Ethereum contract that maintains the DAO that actually runs the ship, right? In that case, you'd probably set up the ship in such a way that it's listening to that contract and behaves accordingly. You could probably even do more exotic things about like maybe each person involved in the Dalten Collective runs each knock event that this machine is supposed to run, and even like tracks the Urbit state, like the state of the star potentially. Or maybe it tracks that so that everybody can actually sort of prove to themselves that that the star is doing what the collective wants it to do. I think you might want some kind of feedback mechanism from there. If you want this to be a sort of really autonomous, decentralized thing that runs a star. I'm kind of spitballing on that part of it, but I do think you would want some kind of feedback mechanism there in order to get it to be really trustless. And fortunately, because an Urbit is a deterministic computer, it may be possible to actually to do that sort of thing.
Yeah. So kind of what I hear you're saying too, what also really resonates with me is something like like a co-op in the traditional sense, like a farmer's co-op. You'd have multiple, let's say, orchards, and you all bundle your products together, and then there's some smaller entity that is the collective that brings them to market, does marketing, handles the books, all that kind of thing. And so in our case, if we want to be able to provide some sort of service to the rest of the network, maybe like you said, that's some routing where there's going to be some edge nodes so that we've got larger coverage. There's going to be probably some storage, so that's going to be something like a content distribution network, whatever those services might be. And it might be great to be able to have it sort of like as many people that want to participate can, but there might be some sort of protocol in which you can come in and add services and some way in which you're compensated from the collectives, sort of like, so if you were a customer of the collective, you'd pay the collective and then it would distribute funds accordingly. And that's exactly kind of sort of what I had in mind when it comes to sort of what this group might want to do. So I think that's exactly on the right track. And thinking about this now and thinking about how this is going to work is I think it's important because I think some of these things are not as far off as they might seem. I mean, as quickly as Urbit is developing and how useful it's becoming in terms of just communicating with other like-minded people, it seems to me that this could be something interesting.
I agree. Yeah, I think this whole idea is pretty interesting. I guess in a similar vein to what I was just talking about, like the flexibility of implementing an Urbit node is, I think, a lot higher than most people would sort of would think at first glance. I would also say that the way that you operate your star is also a lot more flexible than you might think. The kind of relationship that the star has with its sponsees, the nodes that it's routing for. The contracts that we have, the Urbit Constitution lives on Ethereum, doesn't dictate very much at all about how that has to happen. And so there's room to experiment with all kinds of things. Right. And I think a DAO, honestly, I've been trying to figure out, I have some friends who are into DAOs in general. And I keep asking them, like, what are these things for? What do you do with one of them once you have them? And I can never get a straight answer out of them. But then I was thinking about it, and it was about a month ago, and independently, I remember asked on some chat that you were in, Kenny, I was like, I asked, hey, could you run a star as a DAO? Because I thought, like, wait, that's actually a really good use for a DAO, is to run an Urbit star. It makes total sense. And then, yeah, like maybe you want that to be limited to just the sponsees that run it. So it's really a co-op. And you could formally define how the bylaws of that. You could have the bylaws live in Ethereum. Or you could have them live in Urbit, and maybe you could have pieces of data that the Urbits periodically send up to Ethereum to have Ethereum notarize those pieces of data with with signatures, so that you can say, like, okay, I know that this person claimed this. We have right, but it's just there's a lot of interaction that can happen there, and yeah, I think you might want to co-op. I think that's more along with how Dalton is arranged. Although you might also, for example, want to bring in external investors to help run the co-op, or to put money in. That should be something you should be able to do. So, like, basically, maybe even end up building a set of frameworks and protocols for internal governance of a star, or like of a business that's running a star. And maybe those are even pluggable, so that you can configure them and say, like, no, this one's just a pure co-op, or like, no, this one actually anybody can get a share of this star. I don't know the details of how people would want to do that exactly, but I think it should be noted that these things are very open. Like, there's a lot that can be done here.
And I think so too. And I should also say that the one thing that I am also, I want to make sure that, or at least I'm going to put forth my opinion about the Dalten Collective, is that the what of it is important, but also the how we do things is also very important. So I'm actually more interested in the how of things than the what, which is not always intuitive that way.
What do you mean by that?
So how we do things, that's actually very interesting to me in terms of, like, in what ways do we make decisions? How do we structure our interactions? What are the norms that we create to deal with each other and interact, because we're not all going to agree? What are the sort of the modes that we choose to adopt, and how we do that? And then after we do those things, I look at the collective as a process, an ever-evolving way of doing, and then what it does is a sort of expression of that. But I think, yeah, or just for me, I'm more interested in the how we do things than sort of like the what.
Well, so do you want Dalton to be a DAO that's sort of mediated by a blockchain, that's sort of moving towards trustlessness? Is that sort of where you see this going? Or I could also see it going in the totally opposite direction. Like we're going to try to bring together a group of people and have them develop trust with each other.
And the thing is, I don't know, and I'd be perfectly happy with both, or both. And I guess I'd want to say, like, the things that I would want to work on now is, like, how would those decisions be made? that's what I would want to do right now, because
Okay.
that's something that can be done.
Well, what are the questions there?
Well, the questions are, so if you're going to have some decision making process, what is that going to be? How is that going to go? What does debate look like? All of that kind of stuff, and have that as part of the culture now, right? So everybody listening, everybody following along, everybody wanting to participate knows, or at least should come into the culture, and the culture should be fairly clear. Meaning, like, I'll just throw out some arbitrary examples, right? So like in an improvement proposal process or request for comment, there'll be some presentation of some idea, and then there'll be comments about them, and then there'll be some sort of debate. And most of the time, or a lot of the time, those things can be fairly uncontroversial, mostly geared around consensus. Occasionally it's not, and maybe that's when some other method of decision making is employed, like voting. But I think like general processes of coming to consensus in respectful manner is the way to go. And then if there is no consensus that can be reached over some reasonable period of time, then possibly having voting as to sort of move things forward. That's just sort of my opinion right now, and that's where I'd like to encourage the group to head. But ultimately, I'm serious about this star being owned and operated by whoever shows up, for the most part right now. And if they want to manage it and operate it in a different way, that's the quote group's prerogative.
Do you think that the processes for running Dalten should exist inside of Urbit, or do you have an opinion around that? Because I think in our first meeting you had talked about, or someone had talked about, how DAOs are often run outside of the DAO on some forum, web space, or something like that, where these discussions happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's no getting around having other forms of communication besides just Urbit right now. I fully see that Urbit will be full, like, call it feature complete at some point in the future, and then yes, obviously it should happen there. But I mean, like this video conference, for example, like this is not something we could do in Urbit. I can't disseminate this in Urbit right now, even if I wanted to. Like the video files, just that would clog up what we currently have for sure. But as soon as those things becoming available, I would want to experiment with them. So if there was a platform for sharing video, let's say in a year or 2 years for Urbit, totally would do that. I want to use Urbit as much as possible, and I want to push it as hard as we can. But I also want to get work done. So,
Yeah.
I had one more question for Ted. Well, for either of you, really. You had talked about how you could basically log all of the stream of incoming things that happen to Dalten across multiple different Urbits, or facsimiles of the Dalten Urbit, so everyone could confirm that the same things are happening. Could you do the reverse? And I think, Kenny, you were alluding to this. If different Urbiteers, if different people running their own Urbits had services that they wanted to render to Dalten that Dalten could disseminate, could you run your ship and provide the service to Dalten, and Dalten request it from you to provide it to its subscribees, and something like that?
Probably, but can you give an example of what you mean? Like, what is a service that that Dalten would want from me as a personal node?
Well, and maybe a personal node is the wrong way of thinking about it, but like if...
Or is it from me as someone who's involved in running the organization that runs Dalten?
Suppose Dalten is just a software distributor for Urbit, and the idea is you can buy in to then, or you can contribute to Dalten by providing your service, your software to Dalten. Does Dalten have to run the software, or could your Urbit run the software and Dalten act as a face for that? Does that make sense as a question? Maybe it doesn't.
No. Can you give me, like, what would the software be? What do you think?
What about data storage? Yeah.
Okay, so this is the idea that you might want a star to store, that, like, I as a personal node that's part of the Dalten Collective, that I might want Dalten the star to store some data for me. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that should be very doable. I mean, you could write an app to do this right now. It'd be pretty easy. In fact, yeah, I mean, you'd probably want to do it encrypted, I imagine, which would require some effort to do right now, but also doable. And then right now we have no way of sort of trustlessly guaranteeing that a star would honor the commitment that it made to actually store that data. Although the idea of an infrastructure node is that if it breaks its commitments to you, then you can leave. And ideally, there's actually even an audit trail, essentially, where you'd be able to point to something as you leave and say, yeah, I paid this guy to store my files, and he didn't, and so I left. If you get a bunch of people saying that, then that star is going to lose its business, right? So that's a pretty strong incentive, ideally, even without the full trustlessness of the blockchain. But in terms of technical implementation, the way you'd write this is you'd write an app, a Gall app. I think we should rename them to services, really. They're not like user-facing things. It's really like a daemon or a system service. But it's a piece of Hoon code that you run inside of your app. And it can subscribe to other instances of the app on other ships, and even other apps on other ships. You can talk to other apps on the local machine. You can talk to the file system, and send and receive requests to other apps. So it's a very general thing. Yes, you'd write an app on the star that says that can take in a request to store a file from some other ship, and then decide based on looking up something on the Ethereum chain or whatever payment structure has been set up, where it's like if the payment has come in, then okay, I'll accept the file, for example. If it hasn't, then it'll send a negative acknowledgement and say, no, not doing it. You gotta pay me, or whatever the arrangement is. And then you could then I could offload some files to Dalten, and then when I want them back, download them. So I'll probably assign a path to them. Say like, okay, this is Faz Web, Faz Notes, Faz Text. Right, send that off to Dalten, and then request that later when I want it. Could also use it as a backup. But it's actually, it would be a cool service to write, because I don't think there would be that much to it, especially if the predicate for deciding whether to accept the file is simple. You might want to start with just saying yes for now. But it would also be should be relatively straightforward to sort of bolt that onto an Ethereum contract. But basically, maybe just check, for example, like how many megabytes of storage so-and-so had requested from you or had already paid you for. So you write a Ethereum contract like that would use the Urbit addresses and then ideally interact directly with the Urbit contract, like the Azimuth and Ecliptic, so that it could query those contracts directly. So that everything could be expressed in terms of Urbit addresses, and then if the Ethereum addresses that own those Urbits change, then it doesn't matter, right? Mm-hmm. Or you could do it in terms of the Ethereum addresses if that's what you wanted to, but just maybe you could also use the Urbit address space as a way of making sure that there aren't any civil attacks. Yeah.
So I think all three of us are going to be in Denver in a few weeks, right? So hey, why don't
you're already?
I will as well.
Oh, cool. Well, let's hack on that maybe a little bit while we're there. See if we can get something really small like text files, because I don't want to try anything larger than a few kilobytes. Maybe, actually, maybe not even that much.
Sure.
What do you think is what sort of file size do you think is sendable currently?
It's a good question. I haven't tested that. I mean, it's going to be less than 2 gigabytes. Right? That's the real answer. And then the size is going to vary. The max size is going to vary based on how much stuff is already in your Urbit. This is just a limitation of the weight of their current interpreter, where you can only store 2 gigs in there total, including the kernel. anything else. We're working on a different interpreter right now called Jacques that uses a sort of experimental version of the JVM for generating JIT and the rovnys-ricfer system. And so anyway, Jacques, because it's implemented in a different way, it just doesn't have that memory limitation. So you'd be able to send an Ames message that's very long. And the only limitation there is just is going to blow up your swap space on disk. And as soon as it starts eating into swap space, it's going to get really slow. There's a bunch of scaling work that we have to do there that we haven't done because we haven't gone past 2 gigs. Like it might turn out that we need to write our own pager instead of using the OS's pager. Right, so like page pieces to pull pages of memory, in and out of disk and maybe in and out of the CPU. I guess the part that we didn't mess with is really like the between memory and disk. Urbit is a single level store, which means that when you're writing code, anything that compiles to knock, from your perspective, everything is in memory. And the system will take snapshots periodically, and it writes every event to disk. So even if your memory state gets blown away because the machine gets its power plug yanked out, when you plug it back in, if you hadn't taken a snapshot for a while, you'll start from the snapshot, replay all the events that happened after that, get back up to your current state, and be good to go. But that's all sort of transparent to you, or opaque to you, I guess. As the programmer, like, you don't know how that system is totally outside of how you write. And so from your perspective, everything's in memory. And in practice, like if you got 8 gigs of memory on your machine and your Urbit state is 100 gigs, then you're going to have 92 gigs on disk at any given time, basically, right? Or maybe even more if you're running other stuff on the machine. And so, normal operating systems, Unixes, will swap out memory off disk on and off the disk for you. But it might turn out that that has a bunch of performance problems that we haven't encountered yet because we haven't tried it. So I suspect it'll take a few iterations of us working on that to get it to work really well. So for now, it's the 2 gig limit that'll be limiting for Ames. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like Urbit's obviously not ready for primetime use until there's not a memory limitation on it. So it's definitely, it's on our list to fix this year. But yeah, for now, I don't know. There's going to be some like, decryption and decoding and collation of all the packets into one big buffer and all that stuff. So, and we haven't optimized the memory use of that either. So maybe factor in a factor of 10 off of the 2 gigs and say you try 200 megs, that might blow it up in memory. I don't know. Could be a fun thing to test.
Why not? Any other questions for Ted or in general?
Do you know who's part of this? Like, who's going to be part of this collective and how you're going to? I feel like the first thing to figure out for any kind of group like this is deciding on membership.
Mm-hmm.
I know you said you want this to be open to anyone. Is that really like you want us to have some sort of online presence where people can sort of join, maybe join pseudonymously? Are you thinking that would be joining by Urbit address or by Ethereum address or some other identification method?
Well, currently, the Dalten Collective chat group is it's invitation only, by and sort of in both ways. So read and write. So there can be passive members and active members. So in that way, I have a list of people who've expressed interest in both. I wanted to create it that way mostly because you can't uncreate it that, or I mean you can and probably will have to for the next continuity era anyway. But being able to see who's there, that's the best way to do it. So I have a group, I have a list. At this point, it's still fairly casual because most people are just hanging out looking for something to do or something to learn about Urbit. which is totally fine. I'm not really in a hurry here, but I think you're right, Ted. Before anything can actually move forward, some idea of commitment or participation needs to be, sort of figured out. I'm happy to leave it right now as sort of like, whoever shows up as part of the collective until otherwise informed.
I have an idea for how you can do it.
Please tell me. Yeah.
You put up like a, I don't know, PayPal address or something, or maybe a BTC address or something like that. Maybe it's Ethereum. And it can be the place where you receive payment.
Mm-hmm.
You say that you need I don't know, $5 a month from each person that wants to escape to Dalten from whatever other Urbit star they're under.
Uh-huh.
And then if they're actually one of Dalton's
dependents,
sponsees, then they get to participate. I feel like there's something nice about it. It's like is Dalton responsible for routing to you? Well, then you have a say in the collective, and you're paying into it some dues.
Yeah, that seems pretty straightforward to me. It also requires some action on other folks.
And it could also start generating a little bit of money, maybe put it into an LLC or something. You could use that for development or right. You might want to develop an Urbit application. You might want to develop some Ethereum contracts. You might want to just write up some bylaws. But also, like, they could start paying for the star to actually run the star and route packets for people.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a thought.
It is a thought. I like it. I do like it. Yeah.
Maybe it might make sense to like make some place where we can sort of record thoughts and ideas and so on, asynchronously and so on, like a Notion or Roam Research or whatever.
Oh yeah, what was that last part? I missed. It got cut off just before you went on.
Roam Research. It's like the new one that everybody in Twitter is talking about. The one with like the graph nodes. Roam Research.
Roam Research. Okay, yeah, I could take.
Yeah, it's kind of neat. But they had some downtime the other day, so maybe give it like another month or two and just use Notion.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll definitely post some stuff into the chat and see if we get any interest.
I like the idea because like you're talking about like the norms and so on, and also like the well-defined aspect of Nock and of Urbit of like in terms of like balancing like the trust and trustlessness. It's like maybe on the smart contract you have like a procedure where like, oh, consensus was broken, we have to like vote or decide like what the next state is. Other than that, if like everything is working on the trust level and like who's participating and maintaining the state and so on. From like the social level and what decisions are being made, like entirely off chain and Urbit world and so on. And so then like the whole sort of bylaws plus like decide, like having your bottom line is trustless, but then you have like a trust aspect where things are going smoothly because everybody's obeying like the sort of procedures of like essentially like the collective state machine and so on. It's kind of like an interesting sort of like it all kind of fits together sort of nicely at the social and the technical layers.
I agree. And actually, I think it's a great metaphor to be thinking about as the Dalten Collective as a state machine, something like that. So if you can imagine yourself as a part of consensus, whatever that sort of means, either practically or sort of metaphorically, and that if, and we're moving from state to state, and it's everybody's job to help make that happen in a particular way. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I was just thinking of, I think like, and I remember talking to you, Sarpan, actually about this a couple months ago, about how DAOs right now use the blockchain for some things, but not for everything. And in fact, like most sort of day-to-day decisions get made just by people in a room talking to each other. And so there's some question as to how involved a blockchain should be in that kind of decision-making process. And I think the same question applies for any kind of logic that would live in Urbit too. And I think that you might have 3 levels here, where the nice thing about Urbit is you can send packets around and not have to pay for them, right? Like, you don't have to pay for every transaction like a blockchain. And you don't have the same latency problems, right? I mean, it's just, it's something.
Data availability.
Yeah, right. And it's like you don't really want a blockchain for all kinds of things. But there's some things where you do, and I think one way to think about this is like, what is it that a blockchain will do for you that nothing else will do for you, and only use it for that? And what is that? It's like really like a sequence of hashes, right? It's like a consensus about a sequence of events that happen, right? So the sort of minimal version of that is you say like, okay, here's a hash of an event, here's the hash of the next event, and the blockchain gives you a totally ordered sequence of these, right, that everybody agrees on. And so it might be that there are kind of 3 levels of organization, or of formalization, I should say, where the least formal is whatever, we just talked about some stuff, right? Made a decision. One more above that as well, we talked about an Urbit, and maybe actually there's an Urbit application that tracks some state about some kind of, it tracks a bunch of state about the state of the organization. Maybe it's got a bunch of files in it. All the bylaws are stored there, and a bunch of intro docs, and posts that people have written, and things that people are working on and whatnot. And maybe that's sort of like an Urbit group where everybody's sharing these files and whatnot. But they're not sharing them with, in order to make money or anything like that. It's just a small amount of data, just like a Google group, right? But then it might also be that there are official, votes that take place about, say, changing the bylaws or something where it's like you really want to know, like if some historian or auditor comes and looks at this organization later and wants to know like what's the sort of official history of this, then basically all that stuff should go on a blockchain in some form, I think, because this idea of it's one shared consensus permanent record seems like a very useful thing to have for any kind of semi-official organization, any organization that attempts to be rule-abiding. But the minimal way to use that is just to post hashes of something. So it could be that, for example, you have some sort of protocol inside of Urbit for, say, voting on bylaws, right? Maybe you use Urbit's ring signature functionality so that within the group, like it's a secret ballot, cryptographically secret ballot. This is actually something we've written. But then it could be that the results of these get written to the chain, and maybe there's an Ethereum contract that enforces the rules based on that, or maybe it's just that there's a hash of a knock program, or a sequence of knock events that with the hashes which get put on the chain. Then everybody in the organization just stores the state, so they know what those hashes refer to. But basically, like you might want to just use the blockchain from Urbit as a way of publicly and permanently sort of notarizing that something happened.
Yeah, maybe like weekly sort of checkpoints, and like if there's like any maybe discrepancy, maybe just like a vote on like whatever it is to sort of adjudicate like, okay, this is what the next state will be. Some people lost messages that didn't get to them, or they just started to behave maliciously or whatever, and so on.
I guess I see it less as a sort of like something that would happen on a timer, and more sort of like whenever there's a sort of an event that happens within the organization that's momentous enough that it should be recorded for posterity.
That makes sense, yeah.
It's a little bit of a different idea, I think. But I don't know, maybe there's something that you'd want to run on sort of a cron job. Yeah, I mean, it might just be like you have weekly meetings and you want to say who was there at the weekly meeting. Maybe you want to write that on the blockchain so people know who was talking at what time. I don't know. Maybe you don't care, but
who knows?
I think this is one of those things about trustlessness, right? It's like, how trustless do you want it to be? The more trustless you want it to be, the more stuff you want to write on the chain. If it's just like, 3 friends that, live next door to each other, then you don't need anything digital at all. But if it's, people from all over the world and people come and go, and it's been going for decades, and it's, and the rules keep changing. There's a lot of money involved.
Mm-hmm.
You really want to write things down.
Yeah. All right, guys. So we've been going for an hour. I think we should wrap it up. Anything else for Ted before we head out? Cool. Well,
I'm happy to rant about anything you want me to.
You are. I appreciate it. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks for joining. I'm gonna go ahead and post this up on YouTube, and for the folks that weren't able to join live, and yeah, I think getting into a regular habit of these hangouts would be a good idea. I'm kind of thinking maybe every other week at the moment. Probably, sometime similar to this. So just keep an eye out for any messages in the chat, and I'll try to keep everybody informed. I was also going to try and post up a simple web page, kind of briefly describing kind of the idea of what Dalten Collective is, so people can see something. Haven't quite got that worked out yet, but I don't think it'll be too hard with the yeah, there's some good documentation on how to do that. So, and I know who to ask if it doesn't work. So, all right. Anyway, thanks everybody, and yeah, we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.